And you have to go through budget committee, any meetings that you have. So a lot of legally required things you have to do between now and then. And so this is actually taking up quite a bit of my work week as a city administrator. So in the last few days, I sent out notices to the newspaper, got them posted to the website about our budget committee meetings and when they are and how you can participate. At the request of some of our city councilors who are on budget committee, started preparing an organizational chart, getting from our financial people information about employee salaries, lists of our contracts that we have. So the contracts that we pay out for third-party services is one of them. And then kind of the IGAs that bring revenue into the city. And this is part of efforts to just make the city of Raineer's budget process more transparent than it's been in the past. So we're trying to go the extra mile and give our folks more information. So I'm going to start off and tell you a little bit about my background. I was a reporter in a past life. So I covered local government in many jurisdictions. So down in Southern Oregon, in Jacksonville, Rogue River, Gold Hill, Cave Junction, Grants Pass, Josephine County, and my first job out of college in Turlock, California. So I've sat through probably more budget committee meetings in my life than I ever thought I would or ever wanted to. But in that role, it's pretty simple. All right, you basically just take and explain the major differences in the current proposed budget from the previous budget. And I will say that for the most part, most budgets are largely status quo. It's not like most municipalities get a huge boom in revenue from year to year. I mean, it's fairly predictable in the amount that it goes up. Most local government organ is funded through property taxes, and there are limits put in place for those property taxes, right? So it's not like suddenly your property tax bill is going to jump 10% and your local city goes, oh boy, we have 10% more revenue than we had before. It's usually pretty close, 2 to 3% difference year to year, kind of as the cost of living gets adjusted. The big exception, of course, is if revenues fall drastically. And I've seen that happen too. So I mentioned that I'd reported in Josephine County. I was there during the Great Recession. And because that was based on housing and caused by the housing market, it hit local municipalities really hard. So when you're dependent on property tax revenue and all these houses throughout every county are in foreclosure, it ends up hitting your bottom line. So we reached a point in Josephine County where we had no libraries for a year. We had very limited law enforcement. And so the people on the budget committee at that point had to make some really difficult decisions. But for the most part, it's not, unless you have the greatest recession in almost 100 years, being on a budget committee is not that bad of a gig. So at the state level, I've worked for 5 legislators, all of whom were on the budget writing Ways and Means Committee. So first was 2005, Dennis Richardson. He was chairman of the Ways and Means Human Services Subcommittee at the time. When I was at the House Republican office, House Republican leader Mike McLean was on Ways and Means. I was chief of staff for Senators Doug Whitsitt and Ellen DeBoer. They were both on Ways and Means. I did work for Doug's wife, Representative Gail Whitsitt. She was also on Ways and Means. So you figure I know the state budget inside and out, but I don't. My job was basically to make sure that my bosses had what they needed to make the votes that they did on budget bills. What I can tell you about the state budget is it's grown exponentially without services seeming to get better. Right. I mean, I know what the budget looked like in 2005, what it looks like now, and are the services twice as good? No, I don't think so. And then when I was still in the Senate, I did grad school at Portland State University, got an executive master's in public administration, took advanced public budgeting taught by former longtime Lake Oswego city manager Scott Lazenby. Senator DeBoer helped me with my homework. He was a former mayor of Ashland. He's a business owner, self-made multimillionaire, and he advocated a very simple approach. And it's true that if you look at your average municipal budget document, it's more convoluted than it needs to be, right? and there's a lot of money that kind of flows in and out between different departments. And what Alan taught me was, he said, what matters the most, see what's coming in and see what's coming out. And then you have kind of your beginning fund balances, right, which is your carryover from the year before. That's all cash on hand. Your reserves are cash on hand. Your contingencies are cash on hand. For example, Josephine County had like this intergovernmental service fee that all the departments paid into, that was then used to provide services and to fund services for all of the county's departments. That's basically the same money being circulated over and over again, right, internally. And so Alan's approach and what he suggested to me has helped out hugely in these processes. So I took over as city recorder for the city of Aurora back in 2018, did that until last September. So that was through 3 budget cycles, each one with a different mayor. So I was chief administrative officer of that town, but they had a finance officer who handled most of the budgetary matters. And similarly, we didn't see really any big changes from year to year in the budget. It is what it is. And most budget committee meetings, believe it or not, are not widely attended by the public. So you don't, unless you're making those kinds of drastic cuts and people are advocating against it. Most of the budget committee meetings that I ever went to, as a member of the press or as city staff, not really anybody there. I mean, I kind of wish the press would cover these things, but we didn't get a lot of coverage in Aurora. And I'm curious to see what kind of coverage we get in Raineer, if I'm going to have any reporters showing up at budget committee, and because there's not going to be a whole lot to report, because, as I said, the budget isn't going to be very much different. So normally I wouldn't be this involved in the budget. I've been with the city since September, so that's about 8 months. But at the March city council meeting, the council voted unanimously to name me co-budget officer. I wasn't expecting that, right? It came as a total surprise, but they wanted me to get more familiar with the budget and with the processes. And that's been my big emphasis, is on the public processes and making sure that, because that's the citizens' voice in the process is done through budget committee. So right out before I was even named budget co-officer, I knew that all this was coming up. So I checked the roster for budget committee from the previous year to say, okay, who do I have to work with, right? And so, like any city, our budget committee is consisted half of city council and then an equal number of citizen representatives, which is why it's so important to me that there be good representation on that body. So you're talking mayor and 7 councilors in this city, 16 total budget committee positions. So half of those are council. We had to replace some seats on there over time because some folks moved out of town. So right off the bat, I look at this list and I see 3 vacancies. So even while the committee was meeting last year, there was 3 open positions on budget committee. I go through the roster. Okay, here's another member who was appointed to council. Okay, that's 4 vacancies on budget committee. So I said, oh, well, let's see what I have to work with. So I called down to everyone else on the list. And even though most of the few remaining folks on the list said they could do it, one of them said he couldn't. 5 vacancies. 5 vacancies on budget committee, which means that citizens would be vastly underrepresented on that body if I did absolutely nothing to fill those positions. And I wasn't going to do that. So we started advertising on the city's website, got that announcement out to the local news outlets. They fortunately used it, and city councilors recruited some people they knew. We even brought back some former city councilors. And so we got the approximate number of applications that we needed to get those completely filled. Some folks applied who were outside of city limits, but under budget law, they couldn't be considered because you have to live within the actual jurisdiction. And so these members were appointed at the council meeting earlier this month. And so essentially what I'm going to get at here is budget committee provides you with ample opportunity for local government involvement. And there's plenty of avenues for that. So for example, I've reformed a parks committee, right? I did that in Aurora. I've done that in Raineer. That's easy. people love parks, right? You will literally have zero difficulty filling a parks committee. But believe it or not, budget committee is like pulling teeth, right? A lot of folks do not want to be involved with that. Planning commission, right? Similarly, you'll have some of the same issues. Folks don't want to get involved in making land use decisions. And one thing that I've emphasized when I talk to different groups, I talked to the Columbia County Republicans a few weeks back. A lot of times conservative candidates, when they're running for office, they'll put in their voter pamphlet statement, right? The section that says prior governmental experience, they'll literally bold, italicize, and highlight no prior governmental experience. That's fine, but those folks usually don't win, right? So even though it caters arguably to the conservative base, swing voters, non-affiliated, independents tend to want people with some semblance of local government experience. This isn't on-the-job training. And the upside of being on a budget committee is that it makes you more familiar with the processes involved, so that if you do get elected to something like state representative, you have less of a learning curve. So guys like the aforementioned Dennis Richardson, he'd been a city councilor, and I think he'd also done some local budget committee stuff for the school district before then. So it's one of the reasons he was such an effective legislator, even in why he got to chair a Ways and Means subcommittee as a sophomore, because he knew what he was doing, because he'd already done his time at the local level. And the thing is that even if you don't have a background in government, you can use your perspective to help get the government that you want. And it is useful to have people with business type backgrounds. Some folks scoff at this notion that government should run like a business. And there are some differences, right? There's no competition, for example. But things like customer service should matter. And the way that people spend their own money versus the way that you spend other people's money. It's sometimes appalling in this state. And the good thing about local government is that you can get more done. It's more responsive. It's arguably a thankless job in many respects. Most of these are volunteer positions, but the reward is that you've improved the quality of life for folks in your corner of the world. And it does help for other local positions. Our friend Lindsay Burschauer served on the Yamhill County Budget Committee. She was elected commissioner outright in the May 2020 primary election. And that was due largely to her experience on budget committee, because she could speak authoritatively about the county budget. People knew that she knew what she was talking about. And school districts also have budget committees. They have a really hard time filling those positions. It's a great way to be involved. And the other part of that is, as an administrator, I'm directed by my mayor and city council. And similarly, the budget committee directs staff on spending priorities for the city, right, or the municipality that you're working with there. So as staff, we can make recommendations. And I have a budget request list going right now that I'm going to be giving to budget committee members as part of that discussion. But that's why it was important to me that those vacant positions be filled, because the city's budget needs to reflect the priorities of the citizens of Raineer. And if I only have like 3 lay citizens on the budget committee, then we're not getting that full picture of what people in the community really want. So process-wise, internally, I meet with my department heads ever so often. So that's, public works director, chief of police, our office manager, and those department heads draw budgets for their departments, which again are largely status quo. I mean, your employees we're not adding any employees, we're not getting rid of any employees, and we are a union shop, so their salaries are determined by collective bargaining agreements. And most municipalities, your biggest expense is payroll, right? That's where most of it goes, is salary and benefits for your employees. So that helps really give you the basis of the budget. In fact, we just did union negotiations for our police department. And so, they get a 3% raise under the agreement that we're signing now. And so that's going to factor into the budget going forward for the next couple of years because it's a 2-year agreement. So that, combine that with the list of budget requests, and a lot of those are things that have come up at city council meetings where they've said, oh, well, maybe we want to televise our meetings in the future. Okay, well, that's going to be like $3,000 a year. So that has to be a budget request. We have a library. The librarian said, oh, we want another $2,500 a year for more materials, right? For books and DVDs and books on tape. Okay, that's a budget request. They wanted to do a tree removal program. So that's $5,000 a year. The general fund is what it is. So now it's going to be up to budget committee and city council to decide, okay, we want to fund this. What do we not fund instead of that? Right? Are there some line items that we tweak over here to make up for this 5,000 we want to spend on this other thing? And that's how it worked in Aurora. So the original proposed budget wasn't drastically different any of the 3 years that I did the budget there from what was eventually adopted and approved. It was literally just little tweaks here and there. Oh, well, maybe we should spend a little more on this. Maybe we should spend a little less on that. That's essentially what Alan DeBoer told me years ago, which was, here's what's coming in, here's what's going out, here's what your numbers were from the previous year. And then you just kind of have to throw some spaghetti at the wall in some instances and make sure these numbers balance in the end. And that the things that you want funded, your programs and your priorities, are funded to the extent that you want them to be, right, within the confines of the limits of the money that you have coming in. So, again, getting back to process, that's one of the steps, is having your budget officer appointed. We have a finance manager. Most cities have a finance director. It's typically that person. So I don't think I've ever seen it to where a city councilor or a lay member of the budget committee suddenly becomes budget officer, because that's more of a staff thing. There's a lot of work that goes into it, and your budget committee members and counselors are essentially volunteers, and you don't want them taking on that responsibility and potential liability, to be honest. So you do your proposed budget. We're working on the final figures for that now. When we sent out the budget notices, it said, as part of that, by May 10th, you should be able to come down to City Hall and get a hard copy of the budget, right? Or have it on the website. And so that's our deadline. We've got a couple of weeks now to get that before our budget committee members, so that they'll have a week. We scheduled the meeting for the 17th. See, that's my stupid mouth failing me again. They'll have a week to go through the budget before the first meeting, which should be enough time. And at this point, we only have one meeting scheduled, but the notice also says other meetings could be scheduled as needed. So because of the COVID restrictions, we're not doing it at City Hall, because that's 16 people plus staff in a room. So we're going to be doing the Masonic Lodge, which is much larger. And so people are able to spread out a lot more there. And, obviously that meeting's open to the public. It has to be as part of the process. There's usually a budget message. Sometimes mayors do it. I've usually seen mayors do it. Sometimes it's the finance officer or the budget officer that does it. And that's essentially a narrative that outlines the budget and its priorities and its objectives. Here are the projects that we were working on. We finished those. Here are the projects that we're going to be working on now. So it just tells the story. And sometimes, depending on the municipality, in your first budget committee meeting, you have department heads giving presentations about their agency's budgets, right? So like the chief of police or the sheriff gets up and says, here's where we're at, here's what I'm doing differently, and they answer questions. We'll probably have that be part of our process too, right? Public Works director gets up and says, hey, we need these sewer mains replaced. We're working on paving these roads. And that's the chance for the budget committee members as citizens to say, well, that's great that you want to pave this street, but I live over by this other street. It's in even worse shape. We should prioritize paving that street instead. And that kind of input is valuable. So typically, that's your first meeting, is kind of the overview of the budget, presentations from the department heads. And then your second meeting, a lot of times, is a deep dive. That's where the decisions are made. That's where you kind of go through the budget one line item at a time. All right, does this work? Do we want to make any changes here? The members at that point ask questions, propose their changes. And sometimes there's a third meeting, but I haven't seen it happen very often. That's more like if changes need to be made to the changes. But most of the bodies I've ever seen, even getting to the second meeting is a bit of a stretch. If you've done the third meeting, it's maybe because folks are, have a lot of input, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And so, and a lot of this is covered in the materials that Rich posted. So this stuff, aside from my anecdotal stuff. So then, the budget committee gets together, they say, all right, fine, this looks good to us. So they approve the budget. Then there's a summary that gets published and notice of the budget hearing. And so that's going to take place at our June city council meeting. And that's where you have a series of resolutions that adopt the budget, another one to receive state tax revenues, one to approve the tax rates, one to approve the appropriations. And that's typically done as a public hearing. But again, by the time it gets to that point, the citizens on the budget committee have been able to weigh in on it. And I don't think I've ever seen a citizen get up at that point in the process and say, this is outrageous. I can't believe you guys spent, $15,000 on a pool that nobody's going to use. Like, never, literally not once. But the opportunity is there. It's afforded to you under state law that, okay, that's your time. Speak now or forever hold your peace. That this whole budget is nonsense and you guys dropped the ball and you're funding the wrong things. And again, I've never seen it, but that would be your chance right there. So that's pretty much what I had, unless anyone has any questions. I hope that helps between that and the handout to kind of get a perspective of what it looks like as you're preparing for budgeting process, as a guy who's new-ish to city management, but been in it for a couple of years and been around it quite a bit. So really appreciate you guys turning out for this and hope it was worth your while.
Scott, I want to thank you for your reason. I want to remind everyone, I think I put up a text that there is a companion document to go with this training. It is available on the www.westernlibertynetwork.org website. It's on the front page right now, but after I change it for the training for next week, it'll still be on the back page, or the training tab of the website. Other trainings that are recorded are available there as well. And a lot of the other training documents are there as well. Does anyone have any questions for Scott?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay.
Well, I mean, we heard her, so she would have been unmuted, right?
Okay. Now I'm unmuted. My name's Lori, and I wanted to get smarter on how to spot, I'll say it, holes in the budget, say like padding, in a budget. Because I have a friend, and she can look at a budget and say, hey, that's overfunded, that's padded. How do we get smart on that?
Well, that's part of why you demand transparency. Like I said, most of any agency's budget is personnel costs. So then you've got that, but then you've got kind of discretionary funds. And so you try to limit those on this end. For example, our chief of police bought some Dodge Chargers a few years back for cop cars. Well, it turns out that Dodge is very bad at making cars, right? So some of these cop cars have been in the shop just as much as they've been on the road. That's cost the department a fortune. So now they're replacing them. Most cities that I've worked in have had a vehicle replacement fund. And so it was beyond me why we didn't and don't have a vehicle replacement fund. So that's been an ongoing discussion, and maybe budget committee goes there and maybe they don't, because your options are you can either set aside X amount of dollars every year in a fund in case one of these crappy Dodge cars craps out on you, then you can actually replace it immediately, or you limp through and keep vehicles in the shop, which I think ultimately costs you more. So that's part of why we're including the salary information, right? Without identifying information, although it's a small town, so you can probably figure out, right, what everybody there makes. But that way, the way a lot of budgets are done, it isn't transparent. Because, for example, when I was in Aurora as the city recorder, my salary was paid out of the budgets for different departments. So if you go into the public works budget, for example, you'd see that, okay, part of this is going to admin, but that doesn't really give you the full picture. So that's part of why we're doing that. So I would look at those kind of discretionary funds, and some of them are necessary. For example, we have a street contingency fund in Raineer. We also have, because of the geography of the city, there's like a landslide happening, right? Just right up the street from City Hall. Getting the geotech study done was something like $40,000. Well, we have like $50,000 in a street contingency fund. So that's a contingency, right? That's what it's for. But and similarly, municipalities, you want them to have reserves, you want them to have cash carryovers, so that way, if your revenues dry up completely, you can still operate, right, and keep the lights on. But if you have too much in the way of these funds, then people are going to say, well, you're obviously taxing us too much. And it's probably a valid argument, right? You're charging us way too much if you guys are able to sock away so much money every year. So it's a balancing act. But that's where it helps to have a background in business. That's where it helps to know how to read spreadsheets and things like that. I hate Excel, not quite as much as I hate Zoom, but I don't like it one bit, because I think a lot of municipal budgets are way more complicated than they need to be, and I think they're almost done in such a way to be confusing. That was a lot of my experience at the state level working for these legislators who were on Ways and Means. I mean, the different agency budgets, luckily a guy like Dennis Richardson and Doug Whitsitt, they would actually go through it, right? Dennis Richardson caught all kinds of things. The human services budget, for example, it turned out that DHS was renting office space in downtown Portland for years that they had never used. Right? Just wasting all this money that wasn't their money, that's your money and my money, right? Taxpayer dollars. And you wouldn't spend your own money this way. But here's DHS, paying this small fortune to rent this office space that nobody was using. So it takes a particular skill and attention to detail to catch those kinds of things in budgets. But that, and I love the name, by the way. That's my daughter's name, Lori. She was taking a nap. I think she's waking up now, and you might hear some screaming in the background if it doesn't go well. So I hope that answers your question.
Scott, I wonder if you might comment on the need to get involved early in the budget process.
Well, yeah, because if you were to try to get involved in budget committee right now, it'd probably be too late. Budget committee meetings are starting to happen. right? I mean, we're days away from May, and the meetings usually happen in May, so that it gets before the governing body, right? So you have budget committee makes their recommendation to the governing body. That's why it's a recommended budget. And then, right, an approved budget, and then it gets to the actual governing body in June, and they don't have much time to punt it. Right? So that's why I think that's part of the reason why your governing body is half of your budget committee. Because similarly, I've never seen it get to where a budget committee adopts a budget, right, approves a budget, and kicks it over to the city council, and the city council says, this is garbage. You guys spent way too much money on the wrong things. You budget committee, you need to get back together and you need to fix this. It doesn't happen. So yeah, your time to get involved in budget committee would have been a few months ago. But those positions, like I said, I mean, they're typically advertised, and a lot of times they go unfilled, or it's the same people who do it year after year reluctantly because they've always done it, and nobody else wants to. For example, the gal that handles our day-to-day financial stuff, they were trying to recruit her to be on the school board budget committee because she'd done it before, right? I mean, she's a little bit younger than me. And she told them, well, if you can't find anyone else, I will do it. But yeah, she's got young kids. And so that's kind of her choice. Okay, do I do budget committee for the school, or do I go to my kid's baseball game? So luckily they did find someone else, and she's able to go to her kid's baseball game. But especially for fiscal conservatives, and folks who are budget minded, it's a fantastic opportunity. And then if you do run for state representative or city council or something, it's on your resume, prior governmental experience. Oh yeah, I did budget committee. A lot of folks look at that and go, oh, okay. Well, this guy's serious, as opposed to, I've never run for anything. I've never served on anything at the local level. Hey, can I represent you in Salem? I do not see those people win very often.
Okay, are there any other questions for Scott? Okay, if you have a question for Scott, you'll have to unmute. We have a bunch of people muted. Okay, I don't think there are any more questions.
All right, well, let me go see how my little girl's doing, and if nap time is going well, or if nap time is over, or if there's anything I need to do there, probably get some lunch. But yeah, thanks for listening. I mean, I hope you guys walk away learning some things that you didn't know before. And seriously, it's extremely easy to get involved at the local level. We're just short of like begging people to get on things like planning commission and budget committee.
Yeah, these are gimmies. If you want to get involved, and your friends, the people you work with, want to get involved, these are gimmies to get involved and to get a very serious credential by working on these budget committees. Even if you don't join a budget committee, this information and that Scott has given you and the training document will help you at least track what's going on and know when the things are going to happen. And if you want to have input, when to have input. If you want to have input, you've got to get active right now. There's still time to get your 2 cents in to the budget committees that are going to be meeting in May. But it's the kind of thing you want to get involved early on. Scott and I have been friends for years, and Scott has generously given of his time to provide training at our annual conferences. I want to thank him for his time today, his expertise, and we'll give it one more shot if anyone has a question they'd like to ask Scott before he leaves us.
And for the record, I do much prefer those conferences to Zoom. This is ridiculous.
Yeah,
right, Rich? I mean, really... I don't live. I live like over in your old neighborhood, not too far from where your office is, and I miss being able to do that. Right, the conferences, they're usually just at one of the local hotels here in Lake Oswego.
Yeah, we're going to return to that. We did a live training at Burns last week. We did one the week before in Bend. On Tuesday, we're doing a training up in Clark County live. And we're going to continue to do these Zoom trainings to augment the live. Live trainings are certainly awesome. It's good to be able to interact with people in person. So I hear you completely. But with that, I guess we'll call it a session. I want to thank everyone for participating. We'll be back next week with Washington County Commissioner Bob Terry. So thank you again, Scott, and God bless everyone. Have a great week.
All right.